It is 9 minutes past 10 on Monday, the 8th of June. It is quite overcast here in London today, but apparently the pubs might be opening in England again on the 22nd. So in a couple of weeks' time, we may be able to have a pint again. Now, I'm joined today by Nickolai Hubble over at Exponential Investor. And in today's market broadcast, we'll be discussing a few of the events that we see as important coming up this week. Nickolai, how are you getting on?
Yeah, pretty good. I actually have been having pints regardless, just without you, Boaz.
Quite. I've been having quite a few pints myself, but there's nothing quite the same as a freshly poured pint at a pub, of course, even if it will only be outdoors. Hopefully some of the weather will be decent enough. Be pretty ironic if all of the good weather we've had during lockdown does not continue as soon as they start opening the economy up again. But it seems like, a very British event to take place.
The weather doesn't put you off, Boaz, anyway.
Oh, certainly not. Certainly not. I don't think anything actually would be able to stop me from heading to the open pub at this point in time. But in terms of what you've been looking at this week, you were telling me about what you call Lagarde-esque as to what we have to expect from the European Central Bank in the near future. Could you expand on what Lagarde-esque is for our listeners, please?
Yeah, it's a pun that works in so many different ways. I don't know where to start. But what we've got is, as we've often pointed out in the past, a convicted criminal in charge of Europe's monetary policy. She is a specialist at ignoring the law, and they put her in charge of the ECB to do so, to pursue saving the euro and the Eurozone by printing money, which is probably illegal. Now, she's recently started doing quite a few different new policies that are even more likely to be illegal under German law, at least under German interpretation of the law that governs the ECB and Germany itself. So you've got her largesse trying to rescue the Eurozone. She's also seen as sort of the guardian, so Lagarde-esque is the other way the pun works, the guardian of the Eurozone. Now, because she's the only one that's really keeping it together, the trouble is that there are other ways for this whole thing to go wrong. For example, you've got, I think it was the Swedes that came out a few days ago saying they would not support the EU's bailout plans as they currently stand. And there's also a lot of criticism coming from the frugal nations. I can't remember the list off the top of my head, but it includes Holland, for example. Those countries are saying that the plans to spend the money that's been raised do not restrict the way that money can be spent sufficiently. So what they're basically saying is the money that is being put together to battle coronavirus and the coronavirus fallout will not necessarily be spent on that, which means it is, as you talked about in the past, Boaz, a way of creating a bit more of a fiscal union. It's a stepping stone towards that, because the funds will not be restricted in how they'll be used. They're not just going to be emergency funds. They're going to be used in a wide variety of different ways.
Right. Yeah. In terms of the new money printing operations that Lagarde may be able to use and employ. Do you see anything very special coming up? Like it's something we've not seen before, which will be, as everyone's throwing the kitchen sink at the problem. Do you think that they'll need to get even more creative than they already have been?
Yeah, and the particular problem is that they're not allowed to get more creative. So if we go back to what the German court said, one of the things that made the policy potentially illegal as it stood back then was that it resembled making economic policy instead of monetary policy. And that is illegal under the treaties. The distinction is whether the reaction from the European Central Bank is proportionate to the problem. And if that reaction is disproportionate, it suggests that the ECB is not just managing the inflation mandate, it's doing something more than that, it's making economic policy. What you've got at the ECB at the moment is a blatant attempt to pursue economic policy in several different ways, such as climate change, such as financing deficits of southern European nations. Now, those things are indirectly or tenuously linked to managing the inflation in the Eurozone. Obviously, there is a link. You can't have a government go bust, say Italy go bust, without it impacting inflation. But the link is very tenuous and it's very indirect, and that is what makes the policy illegal as the Germans see it. And it's also what makes the recent policies more illegal than the ones that the German Constitutional Court ruled on. So if the ECB doesn't manage to justify, and at the moment it's not even trying to, but if it doesn't manage to justify its existing or its past policies, then there's no chance that they're going to be able to justify the legality of the upcoming and the latest policies.
When you said the response of the central bank must be proportionate to the problem, is there not something of a loophole here when you've got something that the Eurozone has never tackled before, something that the world has not really seen quite the same way before? Because you've got this this event which was not predicted by any of the technocrats, and it's seen as this with all of the government mistakes wound into it. This is something that's not been dealt with before, and because it's such a gigantic problem that pretty much any response of the ECB could be perceived as proportionate.
That's right. The issue is that the legalities technically specify the inflation target as the indicator. So, I mean, you tell me, is coronavirus going to be deflationary or inflationary? It's not entirely clear because it's a supply constraint as well as demand.
Right.
But there's a lot of CPI included data that's actually spiking in price, such as meat. And then because globalization is taking a hit, the price that could go up too. So what you've got is an ECB that's supposed to be focusing on an economic indicator that is very narrow and specific. And as far as I can tell so far, it is everything other than inflation and inflation expectations that's going disastrously bad. Unemployment, you've got GDP crashing, you've got trade crashing, all these things are going bad. But the one that the ECB is supposed to focus on, inflation, has not taken anywhere near as bad a hit. And the ECB's inflation target is, quote, below 2% or close to, but below 2%. Now, if the ECB is only focusing on inflation, then it shouldn't be doing the vast amounts of policies that it's pursuing. And then the question becomes, well, why are they doing it then? And the answer is because they're making economic policy, which is illegal.
Right. So it's like, they've been entrusted to save the Eurozone, but the only thing they're allowed to really save, legally speaking, is the inflation rate.
That's right. And it's been fairly clear for a long time that they've been making that economic policy. So if you look at the deficit that the Eurozone nations are expecting to have to finance, I believe it's this year, there was a top German economist or former Deutsche Bank CEO or something like that. He pointed out that the amount of the ECB's QE is an almost exact match for the expected deficits of the various Eurozone nations. The point being that the ECB is being very blatant about doing things such as supporting countries' ability to raise money in the bond market, supporting governments' ability to raise money in the bond market. So if you put someone like Lagarde in charge and you basically say that she needs to print money to save the Eurozone, that is economic policy. That is not inflation targeting and monetary policy.
Right. I mean, I 100% agree that the ECB is involved in economic policy, as I would argue that pretty much any central bank that's been involved in a form of QE has been involved in a form of economic policy, right? Especially when you have the Southern European nations which have lack the creditworthiness of the Northern European nations borrowing so much money. The influence of the central bank in easing that borrowing is a form of economic policy, I would argue, at least. But I mean, do you think everybody just accepts, that that the ECB is conducting economic policy, and they just say, well, you couldn't prove that in court, therefore we're just going to keep going with it? Or do you think some people genuinely believe that the only thing that the ECB really is concerned with, and the only thing it's really doing, is about inflation?
This is the frustrating thing about it, is that the devil's in the details. The legislation is narrow and specific, and that narrowness and specificness is what potentially matters, what potentially decides all this. So that proportionality response is a key part of this. The ECB's QE can only be proportional to the inflation target challenge laid out to it. If it does not act within accordance of the proportionality, then it is an illegal policy. Now, it is for the ECB to justify that, and it is for the German government to make sure that they do justify it. That's the German Constitutional Court's point, is that the ECB hasn't explained itself, and the German government failed to make the ECB explain itself. the German court issued a 3-month ultimatum saying, you have to explain why your policy is not economic policy, it's only monetary policy, why it's proportional, and a series of other minor technicalities that are within the law. Now, the ECB's response so far has been nothing. They've created new policies, new QE-based policies that are even worse by the measures that the court objected to in its ruling. So the ECB is not even attempting to justify itself. Now, I don't know what that means. It could mean that the ECB is being honest by not responding to the German court and the German government because it knows it's conducting economic policy. It's basically calling the Germans bluff, saying, you are not willing to enforce a legal technicality against us because that would blow up the Eurozone. You know just as well as we do that the ECB must conduct economic policy in order for the Eurozone to hold together. So then it becomes, as I think I've said many times before, it's becoming a political question, not a legal technicality question, because whether a country is willing to put up with the Eurozone's breach of the treaty rules and the constitutional rules is a political question. The Germans could decide they're not going to enforce the German court's ruling. They could change the law, or the law could be changed at the European level. So in the end, it's political consent that is the key question. And that's fairly true in a very broad way, because what we're talking about here is politics, which means the making of laws. So, I mean, if the politicians and the top elite lawmakers are the ones dealing with a technicality in the law, well, they can just go and change it, right? So what really matters is whether changing that law is politically viable. It's the Overton window argument. Is it viable for Angela Merkel to ignore the fact that the ECB is breaking the laws? And those laws were laws that Germany agreed to join the euro under. Or is it not viable? Do the Germans actually want their leader to enforce legal technicalities against the Eurozone, risking the euro's existence in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I would offer that if Christine Lagarde and the ECB in general even acknowledged the German court rulings and started dwelling on the question that you've so eloquently put, that this would add huge amounts of weight and credibility to that challenge, right? I mean, if you'd be feeding the fire of this question rather than just ignoring it and hoping that it will go away over time. But what would that actually look like, right? If the Germans wanted to start trying to prosecute, trying to enforce these legal technicalities against the Eurozone, like what would actually happen? What would it look like? What would we see on the news?
It's extremely unclear, but what has happened so far suggests the different angles. So what the ECB and Christine Lagarde have said is that European courts are the only ones allowed to rule on European legal issues. The German Constitutional Court has gone beyond its jurisdiction or beyond its authority in making the ruling that it did. Now, this gets extremely complicated in international law terms, and I'm no expert and don't fully understand it. But it's an argument that the higher court has the power to overrule the lower one. And that's a feature of every legal system I can think of. But if the lower court only made itself subject to the higher court under an international treaty, then, does that still hold true? And that's what the German court's argument is. I don't know what it looks like if the Germans try to enforce all of this. They could challenge or refuse to carry out the ECB's policies, for example. So the ECB would tell the German central bank, the Bundesbank, you must purchase this many German government bonds under our QE program this month. And the German central bank could simply say, no, we're not allowed to legally. And what happens next, nobody knows. There's an argument that the ECB is not allowed to continue that policy at all if the Germans aren't participating, because they're only allowed to pursue that policy under the constraint of doing so equally across the Eurozone.
Right.
Under the capital key argument.
Right.
I don't know if they would stick to that. It's also possible that the ECB would find a different way to buy those German government bonds.
Yeah, that's what I would expect. I mean, would it really be so hard? I mean, for those listening, with the way the ECB sort of functions, is it's sort of a spider at the center of a web of other central banks. So the Bank de France, the French central bank, for example, and the Bundesbank, the German central bank, they still exist. When the ECB was created, they didn't destroy these central banks. They merely became enslaved to the ECB, and they were then made responsible for things like financial stability and regulation within their own countries. So these central banks are still open. They just don't have really any authority or not ultimate authority over their own actions. They still have to wait from the ECB to get on those, especially when it's something like broad Eurozone policy. So if the Bundesbank said, okay, we can no longer comply with these rules, well, with the orders we've received from command, would it really be so hard for example, the Bank de France to start buying all of the bunds that would be required under the ECB's policy for these, the other central banks to start purchasing another country's sovereign bonds?
But if you think about that, it is a blatant disregard for Germany, effectively, German government, German leadership.
Oh yeah, short circuits the whole thing.
And then at that point, it's the opposite of calling someone's bluff. It's overruling them and daring them to react. But I think at that point, politically, the Germans will react. If the ECB is continuing on without the biggest economy in Europe, the Germans will react very badly to that. And this is the bizarre line that Germany's government has to, walk. It's a tightrope walk. So on the one hand, if the Europeans do anything that really irritates the German electorate, then a German government that is very pro-EU will have a problem on its hands. But if the German government sides too much, then they'll have a political problem with the AfD, nipping at their heels. Much as the Brexit Party had a huge influence on the Brexit process here, and the UKIP Party had a big influence on Brexit here, you'd only have to threaten to influence or to gain seats in order to gain influence. And that's what's happening in Germany with the AfD now. So that's why, again, it comes back to political will and votes, basically, in national elections, which is ironic in and of itself, because that is where the decisions to change the law come from. And because we're talking about politics where law can be changed, that is the key measure in the end. So the only way that this becomes truly accountable in terms of, can the Germans just be overruled by the ECB and the EU? Can the Italians just be ignored? And can the Greeks just have austerity imposed even when they elect a prime minister who's promised to do the opposite? Well, they can, as long as the country doesn't threaten to leave. If the country threatens to leave the Eurozone or the EU, that's the point at which the accountability hits, where it all starts to matter. And that is a political decision, as we saw in Britain. What I'd like to point out is that there is a threat that a lot of countries will leave the EU after Brexit if the Brexit process goes well. And the Swedes have come up on the radar recently as threatening to do so, where it's not the key countries like Italy and Germany that leave, but it's a bit of an exodus of the marginal countries that eventually leads to huge political change inside the EU.
Has a word been created for what the Swedes leaving? Is there a word being created to encapsulate that? Would it be Swexit or something different?
I don't know what the word is. I can't recall one. But what makes the Swedish situation so interesting is that they've been fairly Eurosceptic for quite a long time, and they're objecting to the recent coronavirus-linked EU rescue package very strongly. And apparently they're keeping one eye on the Brexit process. And it was commonly believed in Sweden, supposedly, that there's a good chance that they will leave the EU if the process is not a complete nightmare for Britain. But if I can just take a few steps back, I've just opened an article from today from Ambrose Evans-Pritchard. And what I want to point out about this is how normal it is now to believe that the euro is going to fail. So the list of people, of credible mainstream names, who are lending their weight to the argument that the euro is fatally flawed and could fail soon, is getting mighty long. So you've got Thomas Meyer, who was chief economist at Deutsche Bank. You've got Ottmar Issing, who was the chief economist of the ECB when it was founded. You've got Europe's Council of Economic Experts, one of their members. You've got the German Constitutional Court, obviously. You've got a bunch of German economists who actually legally challenged the QE policies. It's Professor Beck. It's basically, the list is just the Euro AFD party. The list of people who are credible top politicians, top economists, bankers, whatever it is, the list is getting very long. This is becoming, mainstream. The Overton window is shifting on this. And I think that's a big surprise to people who just presume that the euro is solid, that it won't struggle, and that the euro works, even though historically speaking, common currencies in Europe haven't. So I think all of this is likely to come to a head in some way in coming years, if not months. The question is whether it's going to be the political process as I predict, or whether the Europeans can reform themselves in some way in time.
Right. Winding back a little bit before, and this is really sort of just indulging my imagination here, but can you imagine a scenario where, so as we say, the German court rules the actions of the ECB to be illegal, and the Bundesbank can no longer comply with an order, for example, to print $200 billion, let's say, 200 billion euros, let's say, of money in order to purchase German bonds, right? So the Bundesbank refuses to comply with a QE order, right? Say, for example, then the ECB then gets the Banque de France to then print 200 billion euros instead, and then to buy those German bonds, that German government debt instead, and add it to its balance sheet instead. Can you imagine a scenario where the Bundesbank then says, all right, well, if you're just going to print money to do this anyway, we're just going to start selling our German bonds in order to annul that action. So if you're going to print 200 billion euros worth in order to buy German bonds through another central bank, we're just actually going to sell 200 billion euros worth of bonds from our balance sheet and thus destroy that 200 billion euro from, in terms of money supply.
Yeah, this creates a big mess in the plumbing of the Eurozone's Target 2 system, I suspect, where the funds will flow back and forth. That is theoretically possible, but I think what is a lot more likely is what Europe historically has done in these situations, which is where the political leaders of each country get together and figure it out at the Council, the European Council. That's where the true power is. It's between the heads of national governments coming together and agreeing on changing the treaty's laws. So they would allow the ECB to make economic policy, for example. They changed the treaties and what governs the ECB and the EU. And they would do that in the midst of some sort of crisis, which makes it seem more justifiable. And that would be how they tide over the crisis. The question is whether they get held politically accountable for that at the subsequent election.
In terms of what do you think might happen in the near term especially regarding this issue of the legality of the ECB's actions in Germany? Is there anything that you see coming up in the near term that we should be paying attention to?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen because the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the German Constitutional Court, imposed a 3-month limit on the ECB for having to justify its QE program, and I can't remember the date that ends, but it's coming up. And it's going to be extremely interesting to see what the enforcement mechanisms are, because there's no point having a court rule that something is illegal well, what does that mean? What's going to happen as a consequence? If there's no answer from the ECB, what happens next? I really don't know.
Well, when you say a 3-month rule, like how do you mean? Sorry.
So the German Constitutional Court gave the ECB 3 months to respond,
right,
to explain how its QE policies are proportional to the inflation target challenge.
Right.
So the ECB's decided it's not going to respond. And this leaves the Bundesbank, the central bank, the German central bank, in the awkward position in between the two masters, I guess. And that's the uncertainty that no one quite knows. But it's a bigger problem because since that court ruling, the ECB's policies have been far more likely in breach of the law than the policies that were actually analyzed in the court ruling. So we're pretty sure that the German Constitutional Court would rule the ECB's policies as illegal. The question is what the bite is that follows the bark.
Right. I mean, do you think it feels inevitable that there would be some kind of upping of the ante by the German Constitutional Court should the ECB simply fail to respond, right?
Yeah, but it's, as far as I know, it's extremely unclear what the upping of the ante really is and what powers they have. Ironically enough, the German Constitutional Court's not far away from the ECB headquarters in Frankfurt. So, I mean, they operate under German national law inside the EU. So that's an interesting one in and of itself.
Quite. There must be some pretty heated conversations. When they reopen the pubs and the restaurants, I can imagine there being a lot of heated conversations that are definitely off the record between the two bodies, right?
Yeah, and it becomes a completely bizarre situation that is inherent in the EU and the Eurozone system, where you've got very different countries bound together under one set of rules. Included in those one set of rules is the monetary policy rules. Now, you've got most of Europe operating under the assumption that no one actually believes in the rules, right? People don't actually follow the rules. We never did historically. We had lots of lovely rules, but no one actually followed them. And you've got the Germans who supposedly fear Weimar hyperinflation if you don't follow the rules, and only agree to join the euro under the constraint of the rules. Now, they forgot to mention that the rules actually have to be followed. So this is the typical example of how, when you get a bunch of nations together, making the rules together, each nation has a different perception of how those rules will actually function in practice.
Right. Well, I guess we'll need to wait and find out to see how the German Constitutional Court really ups the ante and what it might do in order to get back at the technocrats, I suppose. We have run out of time for today, so I think we'll leave it there for the moment. Just to let you know, if you are listening to this podcast, we are changing our schedule slightly, so we're going to be doing 3 per week rather than 1 every single day. It's become quite a challenge just to maintain the daily momentum, so we're turning it back slightly. But of course, we shall be carrying on with these. So we shall have 2 more later on this week. I believe Thursday will be next one, and then Friday the day after. But that sums up today's market broadcast. If you're interested, do give me a follow on Twitter. My handle is @FederalXS. You'll also be able to find Nickolai Hubble on Twitter. You just search for his name. And that is all for the moment. I hope you have a very good week, and we shall see you in the next one.